My name is Ethan Carter, and until that week, I believed I knew exactly what to expect from life in my neighborhood. I lived in a quiet suburban community where everything seemed predictable. The lawns were always trimmed. The streets were clean. The houses looked almost identical from a distance. It was the kind of place where people waved at each other while walking their dogs, and where nothing truly shocking ever seemed to happen. 10 days earlier, I had left for a trip to visit family. It was supposed to be a simple break from my normal routine. I spent time with relatives I had not seen in years and enjoyed a chance to get away from work and responsibilities. By the time my trip ended, I was tired but happy. I was looking forward to returning home and settling back into my normal life. The day I returned started like any other travel day. Long airport lines, delayed flights, too much waiting. By the time I finally arrived in town, I felt exhausted. All I could think about was getting home. I wanted to unpack my suitcase, take a shower, and spend the evening relaxing. As my rideshare entered my neighborhood, I looked out the window and felt relieved to see familiar streets. Everything appeared normal. The houses looked the same. The trees lined the sidewalks exactly as I remembered. For a brief moment, I felt completely at peace. Then I heard the noise. At first it sounded distant, a low rumbling mixed with the sound of machinery. I frowned and looked around. Construction work was unusual in our community because the HOA closely monitored almost every project. Even replacing a fence required approval. The sound seemed strange, but I assumed someone was remodeling their home. The closer we got to my property, the louder the noise became. I leaned forward in my seat and looked through the windshield. That was when I saw something that immediately felt wrong. There was construction equipment near my property. Large stacks of lumber were visible from the road. Workers moved around carrying materials. An excavator sat near the edge of the lot. My first reaction was confusion. Maybe one of my neighbors was building an addition. Maybe I was looking at the wrong area. Maybe I was simply tired after traveling. The driver pulled in my driveway, and I stepped out of the vehicle. For a moment, I just stood there holding my suitcase. My eyes slowly moved across the property. Then my stomach dropped. There was a building under construction. Not near my land. Not beside my land. On my land. I remember blinking several times because my brain refused to accept what I was seeing. A partially framed structure stood where open space should have been. Wooden beams stretched into the air. Construction workers moved through the site as if everything was perfectly normal. Nothing about it was normal. I walked forward slowly, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Every step made the reality harder to deny. The structure was sitting directly inside my property boundaries. I looked around, expecting someone to explain the situation. No one did. The workers continued their jobs. The machinery continued operating. The project moved forward as if it belonged there. I felt anger rising inside me. How could something like this happen? How could a construction project reach this stage without my knowledge? I pulled out my phone and opened a property records application that showed lot boundaries. My hand shook slightly as I checked the map. The screen confirmed what I already suspected. I was standing exactly where I thought I was. The structure was inside my property line. Not partially, not accidentally, completely. For several seconds, I stared at the screen. I hoped I was missing something. I hoped there was an explanation. But every piece of information pointed toward the same conclusion. Someone had started building a house on my land. I took a deep breath and walked toward the nearest worker. The man looked surprised when I approached. I asked him what was happening. He pointed toward a foreman who was supervising the site. The foreman came over and introduced himself. I immediately told him that I owned the property. His expression changed. At first he looked confused. Then he looked concerned. Several workers stopped what they were doing and listened. I asked who had authorized the project. The foreman explained that they had received permits and documentation before construction began. He seemed convinced everything was legitimate. I asked to see the paperwork. After a moment, he handed me a copy. I carefully reviewed the documents. The permits appeared official. The project had been approved, but something still did not make sense. The address listed on the permit belonged to my neighbor Richard Collins. I looked from the paperwork to the structure, then back to the paperwork. The address and the actual construction site did not match. A cold feeling settled in my chest. Either someone had made a terrible mistake or someone had intentionally manipulated the process. Before I could ask another question, I heard a familiar voice behind me. I turned around and saw Richard Collins walking toward us. Richard had lived next door for years. Most people in the neighborhood knew him. He had a reputation for acting like he owned the community. He always had an opinion about everyone else's property. He constantly complained about things that were none of his business. And he never handled disagreement well. What struck me immediately was his reaction. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked annoyed, as though my return had interrupted something important. That alone made me suspicious. Richard approached with a confident smile. I asked him what was going on. Instead of looking embarrassed, he acted completely comfortable. He casually explained that he believed the land should belong to him. At first I thought he was joking. Then I realized he was serious. Richard claimed that the area had been unused for years. He talked about improving the neighborhood. He talked about increasing property values. He talked about making productive use of the land. What he never talked about was ownership, because he knew the truth. The land was mine. I reminded him of that fact. His response only made me angrier. Richard acted as though my ownership was a minor technical detail. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed he would never face consequences. The workers looked uncomfortable. The foreman looked increasingly nervous. Everyone could sense the tension growing. I demanded to know who approved the project. Richard avoided the question. Instead, he kept repeating the same excuses. He claimed everything was legal. He claimed permits had been issued. He claimed the project had been reviewed. The more he spoke, the less convincing he sounded. Something was wrong. Very wrong. As the afternoon continued, I stood there staring at the unfinished structure. 10 days earlier, that land had been untouched. Now a building stood on it. A building that should never have existed. The realization felt surreal. I kept asking myself how this could happen. How many people had seen this project and said nothing? How many approvals had been granted? How many warnings had been ignored? Most importantly, who had helped Richard get this far? By the time the sun began to set, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not a simple misunderstanding. Too much work had already been completed. Too many documents had been approved. Too many people had been involved. Whatever happened here had been planned. And if I wanted answers, I would have to uncover them myself. Standing there, as the evening light faded across the neighborhood, I made a promise. I would find out exactly how this happened. I would identify every person responsible. And no matter how long it took, I would make sure the truth came out. At that moment, I had no idea just how deep the situation went. I had no idea that altered records, hidden approvals, and shocking secrets were waiting to be discovered. All I knew was that someone had built on my property, and my fight to take it back had only just begun. That night, I could not relax. My suitcase remained unopened near the front door. My phone continued buzzing with messages from family asking whether I had made it home safely. I ignored almost all of them. My mind was focused on one thing and one thing only: the structure on my property. I sat at my dining table, surrounded by documents, maps, and records. For hours, I searched through county databases and property archives. I wanted proof. I wanted facts. Most importantly, I wanted answers. The first thing I discovered was both reassuring and frustrating. Every official record showed that the land belonged to me. The boundaries had not changed. The lot lines had not moved. No transfer had occurred. No sale had taken place. No easement existed. Legally speaking, the property was exactly the same as it had always been. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it raised a much bigger question. If ownership was so clear, then how had construction been approved? I continued researching late into the night. The deeper I looked, the stranger the situation became. Nothing supported Richard's claim. Nothing suggested he had any legal right to build there. And yet workers were actively constructing a house on my land. At some point after midnight, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. I realized this was not going to be solved with a simple phone call. Someone somewhere had allowed this project to happen. The next morning, I woke up determined to find out who. I spread every property survey I owned across the dining table. Some were recent. Others were decades old. I carefully compared measurements, landmarks, and boundary markers. The results were consistent. Every single survey showed the exact same property lines. Richard's lot ended well before the construction site began. There was no overlap. There was no confusion. There was no gray area. The evidence was overwhelming. The house was being built entirely on my property. That was why I decided to visit the county records office. If permits had been approved, then there had to be paperwork. And paperwork always leaves a trail. The county office was located about 20 minutes away. The entire drive, I kept replaying the situation in my head. Part of me expected to discover a simple clerical mistake. Maybe an address had been entered incorrectly. Maybe someone had reviewed the wrong map. But another part of me suspected something more deliberate. When I arrived, I requested every document connected to Richard's construction project. The employee helping me seemed surprised by the request. She spent several minutes searching the database before eventually printing a thick stack of records. I thanked her and carried everything to a nearby table. Then I started reading. At first, the documents appeared normal. Permit applications, inspection schedules, construction approvals. Everything looked legitimate. Then I noticed something unusual. Attached to one of the permit packages was a survey map. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, but something about it felt wrong. I compared it against one of the surveys I had brought from home. The longer I looked, the more obvious the differences became. The property boundaries were not the same. Certain measurements had been altered. Several markers appeared slightly shifted. The changes were subtle enough that many people might never notice them. But once I saw them, I could not ignore them. My pulse began to race. I laid both maps side by side. The differences were undeniable. Someone had modified the survey. The altered version created the appearance that Richard owned additional land. Not a huge amount, just enough to make the construction project seem legal. For several moments, I simply stared at the documents. I felt a mixture of anger, disbelief, and determination. This was no longer a mystery about mistaken property lines. Someone had submitted inaccurate information. The question was whether it had been intentional. I requested a meeting with a senior county official. After a short wait, I was escorted into an office. The official listened carefully as I explained the situation. Then I showed him both surveys. His reaction told me everything. At first, he looked skeptical. Then he studied the maps more closely. His expression changed immediately. He compared measurements. He reviewed boundary markers. He examined every detail. Finally, he looked up and admitted that something appeared wrong. That was the first time someone in authority acknowledged what I had been saying from the beginning. The official explained that an internal review would be necessary. He could not immediately explain how the permit had been approved, but he agreed that the discrepancies required investigation. For the first time since returning home, I felt a small sense of progress. Someone was finally paying attention. After leaving the county office, I drove directly to the HOA clubhouse. If anyone should have noticed the problem, it was the HOA. They monitored nearly every visible change in the neighborhood. Residents received warnings over minor landscaping issues. People were cited for leaving trash bins out too long. The idea that an entire house could be built without scrutiny seemed impossible. When I entered the building, several board members were already present. The atmosphere changed the moment they saw me. I introduced myself and explained why I was there. Then I placed photographs, surveys, and permit documents on the table. As they reviewed the evidence, something became obvious. They were uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. Some avoided eye contact. Others shifted nervously in their seats. The room felt tense. I asked direct questions. Who approved the project? What documents were reviewed? Did anyone verify the property boundaries? The answers were vague. Too vague. According to the board, they relied on information provided during the application process. They claimed the paperwork appeared legitimate. They insisted they had followed normal procedures. But something about their responses felt incomplete. Eventually, one board member revealed an important detail. Richard had attended multiple HOA meetings before construction began. He had presented plans, diagrams, and property information. According to meeting records, he spent considerable time convincing people that the project would benefit the neighborhood. The board had trusted those presentations. That information immediately caught my attention. I asked whether copies of those materials still existed. The board member hesitated. Then he nodded. Additional documents were retrieved. As I reviewed them, a pattern started to emerge. The same altered property boundaries appeared repeatedly. The same misleading information had been presented again and again. Richard had not simply submitted a questionable survey. He had built an entire narrative around it. The realization was disturbing. This was beginning to look less like a mistake and more like a strategy. The board members seemed to recognize that possibility as well. The mood in the room shifted noticeably. People who had initially defended the approval process now looked concerned. Some appeared worried about their own involvement. Others seemed angry that they may have been misled. When a meeting finally ended, I walked outside carrying a growing stack of evidence. The sun was beginning to set. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Children played in driveways. People walked their dogs. Everything appeared normal. Yet beneath that calm surface, a major conflict was unfolding. I sat inside my car and reviewed everything I'd learned. The altered survey, the permit approval, the HOA presentations, the repeated use of misleading documents. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. But I still did not know the full truth. I still did not know how many people were involved. And I still did not know how far Richard was willing to go to protect himself. One thing was becoming increasingly clear. The deeper I investigated, the more serious the situation became. What started as a shocking discovery on my return home was evolving into something much larger. There were records to review, witnesses to interview, questions to answer, and somewhere within all of it was the truth. As I drove home that evening, I made another promise to myself. I would not stop until every detail was uncovered. Because if someone was willing to build a house on another person's property, then there was no telling what else they might be willing to do. And deep down, I had a feeling the biggest revelations were still ahead. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. For the first time since returning home, I felt like I was making progress. The evidence was beginning to point in a clear direction. The altered surveys were real. The county had started asking questions. The HOA was becoming nervous. And Richard no longer seemed as confident as he had on the day I returned. But evidence on paper was not enough. I needed something official, something that nobody could argue with. That was why I hired a professional land survey company. If there was going to be a legal fight, I wanted the most accurate and up-to-date survey possible. 2 days later, the survey team arrived. I watched from my driveway as several trucks pulled up near the construction site. The crew unloaded equipment and immediately got to work. Tripods were set up around the property. Digital mapping devices were activated. Bright orange boundary markers were stacked near the sidewalk. Everything looked extremely professional. Richard noticed them almost immediately. I saw him standing in his yard, watching the activity with crossed arms. His expression told me he already knew why they were there. The lead surveyor introduced himself and explained the process. He assured me that every measurement would be carefully documented. Every boundary marker would be verified. Every result would be backed by official records. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. For the next several hours, the crew worked across the property. They measured distances. They checked elevation points. They compared current conditions against county records. As the day continued, I noticed something interesting. Construction activity had slowed significantly. Workers who had once been busy building now spent much of their time watching the survey team. Word was spreading. People were starting to realize something was wrong. By the afternoon, the surveyors began placing boundary markers. One by one, bright orange stakes appeared across the property. Each stake represented a verified property line. Each stake represented a fact. And every new stake brought us closer to the truth. Then came the moment that changed everything. The survey team reached the area where the new structure stood. I watched carefully as measurements were taken. The crew double-checked every reading. The lead surveyor reviewed the numbers several times. Then he nodded. The boundary markers were installed, and they ran directly through the structure. Not beside it, not near it, through it. The building clearly extended onto my property. There was no ambiguity. There was no room for debate. The evidence was impossible to ignore. I felt a strange mixture of relief and anger. Relief because I finally had official confirmation. Anger because the situation should never have reached this point. The lead surveyor eventually showed me the results. He spread a detailed map across the hood of his truck. Using a pen, he pointed to the boundary lines. Then he pointed to the building footprint. The encroachment was obvious. A significant portion of the structure sat on my land. I asked him whether there was any chance of error. He shook his head immediately. According to him, the measurements were accurate beyond question. The evidence was solid. As we discussed the findings, I noticed Richard walking toward us. His expression was far different from the confident smile he wore when I first returned home. This time he looked frustrated, almost desperate. He demanded to know what the survey team was doing. The lead surveyor calmly explained the process. Richard interrupted repeatedly. He questioned the measurements. He questioned the equipment. He questioned the methodology. The surveyor remained professional throughout the conversation. When Richard finished speaking, the surveyor simply pointed to the official data. Facts were facts. No amount of arguing could change them. Richard left visibly angry. That alone told me more than words ever could. If he truly believed the land belonged to him, he would have welcomed the survey. Instead, he reacted like someone who already knew what the results would show. The following day, another important development occurred. The construction foreman requested a private conversation. We met near the site early in the morning. His attitude was completely different from our first meeting. At the beginning of the project, he had believed everything was legitimate. Now he looked concerned. He admitted that the survey results had created serious doubts among the workers. Many of them were questioning whether they should continue. Several had already discussed leaving the project. The foreman explained that contractors rely heavily on permits and property records. If those records turned out to be inaccurate, the consequences could be significant. I appreciated his honesty. More importantly, I appreciated the fact that people were finally paying attention. Later that same afternoon, another vehicle arrived at the site. This time, it belonged to the county. An inspector stepped out, carrying a clipboard and several folders. The internal review had apparently moved faster than expected. The inspector spent nearly an hour examining the property. He reviewed the survey results. He measured boundary markers. He photographed the structure from multiple angles. He spoke with contractors and reviewed permits. Throughout the process, Richard remained unusually quiet. Gone was the confident man who once acted like he owned the neighborhood. In his place stood someone who appeared increasingly worried. The inspector eventually approached me and asked several questions. I provided copies of every document I had collected: survey reports, property records, photographs, permit information. The inspector accepted everything and continued his review. By the end of the visit, it was obvious that serious concerns existed. The inspector did not make any immediate announcements, but his body language spoke volumes. Something was about to happen. The next morning, I received a phone call. The county requested my presence at the property. I arrived within minutes. Several vehicles were already parked near the construction site. Workers stood nearby waiting. Richard was there as well. His expression looked tense. The county inspector stepped forward holding an official document. Then in front of everyone, he attached a notice to the structure, a stop work order. For a moment, the entire site became silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The significance of that document was enormous. Construction had officially been halted. The stop work order changed everything. Before that day, Richard had controlled the conversation. He acted like the project was legitimate. He spoke with confidence. He dismissed every concern. And for a while, many people believed him. But once the county stepped in, the situation became impossible to ignore. The construction site sat silent. The workers stopped showing up. The equipment remained parked in the same place day after day. Every person in the neighborhood could see that something serious was happening. And, as often happens in situations like these, people started talking. Within a week, neighbors who had remained silent suddenly began reaching out to me. Some approached me while walking their dogs. Others stopped me while I checked my mailbox. A few even knocked on my front door. At first, I assumed they were simply curious. But many of them had information. Important information. One elderly resident told me she remembered seeing Richard speaking with contractors months before construction began. Another neighbor said Richard often bragged about expanding his property. Someone else mentioned hearing him complain repeatedly that my land was being wasted. None of those statements proved anything on their own. but together they painted a very interesting picture. Richard had apparently been thinking about that property for a long time. The more people talked, the more details emerged. One neighbor showed me photos stored on his phone. The images had been taken several weeks before construction started. In the background, I could clearly see Richard meeting with surveyors and contractors. At the time, nobody thought much about it. Now those photographs carried much greater significance. Every new piece of information strengthened my case. Meanwhile, my attorney was working aggressively behind the scenes. He reviewed every survey, every permit, every inspection report, every county record, every HOA document. The amount of evidence continued growing. One afternoon, he called me and asked me to visit his office. When I arrived, several large folders were spread across the conference table. The expression on his face immediately caught my attention. Something important had happened. He handed me a stack of printed emails. The emails came from HOA records obtained during the investigation. As I began reading, I felt my pulse quicken. Many of the messages involved Richard. Some discussed construction plans. Others discussed property boundaries. A few contained maps and diagrams. Most importantly, several emails raised concerns about the accuracy of the information being provided. One board member had apparently questioned the property lines before approval was granted. Another requested additional verification. Those concerns were never fully addressed. Instead, the project continued moving forward. The discovery raised even more questions. Had people ignored warning signs? Had they trusted Richard without verifying his claims? Or had they simply assumed someone else had checked everything? Regardless of the reason, the result remained the same. A house was being built on land that did not belong to him. As the investigation expanded, the atmosphere inside the HOA changed dramatically. Board members who once seemed confident now appeared nervous. Meetings became tense. Conversations became cautious. Nobody wanted responsibility for what had happened. Several members openly admitted they felt misled. Others insisted they relied on information that appeared legitimate at the time. The entire situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone involved. While the HOA struggled with its own problems, Richard faced a growing crisis. The stop work order remained active. Contractors demanded answers. Expenses continued increasing, and every new investigation uncovered additional problems. One afternoon, I drove past the construction site and noticed Richard standing alone near the unfinished structure. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The building that once represented his confidence now looked like a monument to poor decisions. Wooden framing stood exposed to the elements. Construction materials sat unused. The entire project looked abandoned. But any sympathy I felt disappeared when I remembered how this situation began. None of this would have happened if he had respected property boundaries. Instead, he chose to gamble. Now the consequences were arriving. A few days later, another major development occurred. The county completed a substantial portion of its internal review. Additional records were released. The findings were troubling. Several documents connected to the permit process contained inconsistencies. Measurements differed. Supporting materials failed to match official records. Information submitted during the approval process appeared increasingly questionable. The investigation was far from finished, but the trend was obvious. The facts were not moving in Richard's favor. Around the same time, my attorney began preparing formal legal action. We spent hours reviewing evidence. Survey reports were organized. Witness statements were documented. Photographs were cataloged. Inspection findings were arranged chronologically. Every piece of information strengthened the overall picture. By this point, the case was no longer based on assumptions. It was based on facts, and facts are difficult to argue with. As preparations continued, neighborhood opinion shifted dramatically. People who once remained neutral now openly supported me. The reason was simple. The evidence kept growing. The surveys were clear. The stop work order was public. The investigation was active, and the unfinished structure remained visible to everyone. Each day that passed made the situation harder for Richard to explain. One evening, several residents gathered near the community mailboxes. As I approached, I overheard part of their conversation. They were discussing the construction project. Not one person defended Richard. Instead, they questioned how the situation had been allowed to happen. Some criticized the HOA. Others criticized the county review process. But nearly everyone agreed on one point. The property belonged to me. Hearing those conversations reminded me how much had changed since the day I returned home. Back then, many people simply assumed Richard knew what he was doing. Now that assumption was gone. Reality had replaced perception. Truth had replaced speculation. The following week brought another unexpected development. One of the contractors involved in the project requested a meeting. We met at a local coffee shop. He explained that growing legal concerns had created serious problems for everyone connected to the construction. Subcontractors wanted answers. Suppliers wanted answers. Insurance providers wanted answers. The uncertainty was affecting multiple businesses. According to him, many people felt frustrated that they had been drawn into the situation. Again, I appreciated the honesty. More importantly, the conversation confirmed something I already suspected. The consequences extended far beyond Richard himself. The impact was spreading. As legal preparations accelerated, Richard appeared increasingly isolated. Contractors were distancing themselves. Neighbors were questioning him. Investigators were examining records. Even some HOA members who once supported the project seemed unwilling to stand beside him. The pressure continued building. Yet despite everything, Richard still refused to admit wrongdoing. He continued searching for ways to justify the project. He continued blaming misunderstandings. He continued insisting the situation would eventually work out in his favor. But confidence alone cannot overcome evidence. And by now the evidence was overwhelming. The final turning point came late one afternoon. I happened to drive past the construction site and saw Richard engage in a heated argument with one of his contractors. The conversation looked intense. Both men gestured toward the unfinished structure. At one point, the contractor pointed directly at the stop work order still attached to the building. Even from a distance, the frustration was obvious. The project had become a burden, a financial burden, a legal burden, and a public relations disaster. As the contractor eventually walked away, Richard remained standing alone beside the structure. For a brief moment, he stared at the unfinished building. The same building he once seemed so proud of. Now it looked very different. Not like an achievement. Not like an investment. Not like an expansion. It looked like a mistake. A very expensive mistake. That evening I returned home, feeling cautiously optimistic. The investigation was progressing. The evidence continued growing. The legal case was strong, and public opinion had shifted dramatically. But I knew the story was not over. The biggest chapter still remained. Soon lawyers, judges, and official decisions would determine the future of the structure. Soon there would be final answers. Soon there would be consequences. And when that moment arrived, the outcome would affect everyone involved. The unfinished house still stood on my property, but its future was becoming increasingly uncertain. And deep down, I had a feeling that the end of this battle was finally approaching.